With me now is Scott McClellan, author of What Happened Inside the Bush White House and Washington's Culture of Deception. Scott, the New York Times editorial page today said your book belongs in the genre of, quote, I knew it was a terrible mistake, but I didn't mention it until I got a book contract. Why didn't you come forward with these criticisms earlier?
Well, first of all, I think when you're inside the White House bubble, some of the larger truths can sometimes be obscured. You are working for someone you have a lot of affection for. You're working 24/7, and sometimes it's hard to step back from what's going on and reflect upon it. And there were a lot of things that I believed at the time that later turned out not to be correct. And when I went back and had time to reflect upon it as I wrote this book, I came to some conclusions that were different from what I felt previously.
But you didn't feel it at the time?
Well, no, there were some things, as readers will see when they read the book, they'll see my perspective during those times, like the build-up to the war in Iraq. I talk about my personal feelings during that time frame. I was deputy press secretary at the time, filling in every now and then for Ari, my predecessor. But I give them a perspective. It's very similar to, I think, a lot of Americans, that we seem to be moving pretty quickly into this war. But I was willing to give the president and his foreign policy team the benefit of the doubt.
You called it a propaganda campaign. Can you give me an example of how propaganda was used during this time period? Sure,
and I do in the book. What I'm referring to is basically the selling of the war and how it's done like a campaign.
But specifically,
and I talk about how the intelligence, as the war accelerated, or the build-up to the war accelerated, became a little more certain. Intelligence of high confidence was combined with intelligence of lesser confidence and packaged together to portray a grave and gathering danger with Iraq. And we now know that a lot of that intelligence was wrong, but at the same time, you have to look at how that intelligence was used. You referenced the New York Times editorial today. They talk about that, and that was something we never wanted people to really look at. It was the intelligence was wrong, but we also went about this in a less than open and forthright way,
so you're
in my
saying
view.
The intelligence was manipulated? Because your former colleagues are saying they had to trust what the CIA was telling them.
I'm saying that caveats were dropped over time, that contradictory intelligence wasn't talked about, so the American people didn't have that full, open, and forthright view of exactly what it said.
So it was manipulated.
That I think would have benefited.
Or it wasn't inclusive.
I think manipulated suggests that the intelligence was changed, and I want to view it that way. The intelligence was what it was, but we took that intelligence and then portrayed it and packaged it in a way to make it sound more grave and more urgent and more ominous than it was.
In other words, it wasn't inclusive. It did not include contrary intelligence.
Well, that's true. That is true, absolutely.
While you were press secretary, you were famous for denying access to reporters who asked tough questions. And now you're criticizing the press for not being tough enough. So isn't that the height of hypocrisy?
Well, and the build-up to the war, and it's the National Press Corps as a whole, that there could have been more done to ask the tough questions. What happened, this is again how the press becomes complicit enablers in this permanent campaign culture by focusing on the march to war rather than the necessity of war. That's where the emphasis and focus was, when I think the emphasis and focus should have been more on finding out the truth. And I talk a lot about that in the book.
Weren't you the ultimate complicit enabler, though? I asked a tough question before the Iraq War, and you personally called an executive at NBC News, and you threatened to deny access to us.
I did?
Yes, you did, once the war began.
I don't remember. I don't remember that.
But did you strong-arm people into not questioning the administration?
My style usually wasn't that way.
Well, it was you who made the call.
I just don't remember that. That may be, but I certainly don't remember that incident. In terms of my style with working with reporters, it was usually pretty straightforward when we were dealing with each other, and I think I had that reputation with White House reporters. But I just can't recall that specific incident.
Did someone tell you, instruct you to deny access to reporters who were asking challenging questions?
Not that I ever remember. No
one said you need to ice them out?
No.
Specifically, how was the media not tough enough? Give me a specific example.
In terms of the build-up to the war?
Sure.
It was where the emphasis and focus was. Again, the emphasis and focus was too much on the march to war and whether or not the president was succeeding in selling it to the American people versus really the necessity of war and whether or not we really needed to be rushing into this war.
But they were being given certain intelligence information.
The book is not a whole historical account of what the press was doing. I have a lot of areas where I talk about the good job that the press does, but one of my concerns is, and this is a good example of it, is how they become the complicity enablers in creating this really destructive partisan warfare that goes on in Washington. They're not responsible for it. The people that are responsible for it are the elected leaders we put in office, and they're the ones that can change it, starting with the President of the United States.
But if they had access to only specific intelligence, which you say was cherry-picked, and certain information was not included,
right.
Some journalists might say we could only go on what we had, and we had Colin Powell testifying before the United Nations Security Council. Can you understand why they were, quote-unquote, complicit enablers in your view?
That's a fair point, too. I mean, certainly the White House tends to build walls. This White House tends to build walls between the White House itself and the press corps. And so that's fair for some reporters to make that counter-argument.
You write in your book that you thought the response to Katrina was a mistake at the time, and yet you attacked those who criticized the response as engaging in a, quote, partisan blame game. Wasn't that a little insincere?
I think what I do is say that upon reflection, we made some serious mistakes in becoming too complacent with Katrina. We had dealt with 4 major hurricanes in Florida just the year before, and we had dealt with other major tragedies like 9/11.
But you knew at the time, Scott, that the response was not sufficient. You felt that, and that's what you write in your book.
I was the spokesman for the president, and I was caught up in playing the game just the way it's played. And I was sitting there defending and advocating for what we were talking about. Yes, we engaged in too much positive spin during that time period, and we weren't able to step back from that time period. So I talk in the book, I put a lot of fault at my own doorstep for some of the mistakes that were made. I fell far short in being the kind of public servant I wanted to be.
In fact, I was going to ask you, did you ever challenge the message you were being instructed to deliver? Or did you simply swallow it whole?
Well, there were times, I mean, Katrina is another example where I talk about how I advocated that the president not do the flyover, which became, and now the policy was the more problematic issue there, but I thought it made the president look too detached from what was happening on the ground when people were still being rescued off rooftops.
And yet you insisted the response was appropriate.
Yes, there are other times that I would bring things up, but in the end, when the decision was made, my job was to go out there and advocate for the president, someone who I still have great personal affection for.
Why did you publish this book now in the middle of a presidential campaign?
Well, first of all, the original deadline, there were a couple of deadlines before this. This was a long process of me going through and writing this book, and I didn't want to release it until I felt like I'd gotten it right from my perspective. Again, this is the truth from my perspective, and I know some people are going to disagree with it, but at the same time, I think most people that read this book are going to see that it's a sincere effort to really be open and forthright with readers so that we can understand what took this presidency off course, which is the overall narrative, and then what we can learn from that and hopefully do something to change Washington for the better. It's also timely to this presidential election because the overall message is about changing Washington and ending the partisan warfare. And I talk about some ideas for doing that in the book. Some ideas that the 2 candidates, well, 3 I guess you still have in there, could use if they're serious about really changing things in Washington, something that I was hopeful we could do and became disillusioned over time when I realized we couldn't.
And what are some of those things?
Well, one of the things well, first of all, you've got to embrace a high level of openness and forthrightness constantly. This White House has been too secretive, too compartmentalized, and this is a very transparent society. I think that you cannot shun that openness and forthrightness. That causes problems later, as we saw with Iraq. The expectations were out of whack, and it came back to haunt us later when things didn't go the way we all hoped they were. But one of the key specific policy recommendations I make is a Deputy Chief of Staff for Governing who constantly focuses on making sure that you're reaching out, engaging in bipartisan deliberation and compromise, something that has been shoved to the side in order to campaign and try to win over the narrative of the day and manipulate the narrative to one's advantage. It's a constant partisan back and forth for power and influence, and we need to get back to more deliberation and bipartisan compromise.
There's some feeling this will tarnish the candidacy of John McCain. Do you support John McCain?
I haven't made a decision. I have a lot of admiration and respect for Senator McCain. He is someone who has certainly governed from the center, and that's where I come from. I'm pretty much a centrist who believes in working together to solve problems and get things done and putting the country ahead of partisan politics. I also am intrigued by Senator Obama's message. It's a message that is very similar to the one that Governor Bush ran on in 2000 and won on, promising to bring bipartisanship and honesty and integrity to Washington.
So you could see yourself actually voting for Barack Obama?
I'd just say I haven't made a decision. But I do think, McCain talked about ending the permanent campaign recently. Senator Obama talks about changing the way Washington works. They better make sure that they have a specific plan for doing that if they're going to actually be the President of the United States, because it's difficult to do.
How do you feel about the response to your book by your former colleagues?
I think it's to be expected. I'm not surprised by it. At the same time, I recognize that the White House would prefer that I not go out and openly and honestly talk about some of these events and some of these behind-the-scenes moments that I think were defining moments in his presidency, moments that we can learn a lot from, and hopefully make sure that we don't repeat those mistakes in the future. In
your book, you claim you were misled by Karl Rove, Scooter Libby, and possibly, you say possibly, Vice President Cheney, that they played no role in the leaking of the name of then CIA agent Valerie Plame. We emailed her husband this afternoon, former Ambassador Joe Wilson. He had this question for you. In your view, was there a conspiracy at the White House to obstruct justice? I don't know. I'm not a conspiracy theorist by nature. You don't have to be a conspiracy theorist to answer that question. But I don't know. I explain in detail late in the book what I do know. I do know that I was knowingly misled by 2 senior White House staffers, 2 colleagues of mine, who I trusted their word. I specifically asked them, were you involved in this, in the leaking of Valerie Plame's identity in any way? And they unequivocally told me no. So you don't think that was obstructing justice in the investigation? Well, in terms of my speaking publicly, I mean, it's not a crime for someone to go out and pass along false information. It is a crime to say something that's false to investigators or prosecutors, as we saw what happened with Scooter Libby in that instance. In terms of the Vice President's involvement, I don't know, but I was directed by the President and the Vice President through Andy Card to go out and exonerate Scooter Libby. I said, give the same assurances I did for him that I gave for Karl Rove. I said I will do that I knew that was an order coming from on high. I said I'll do it only under one condition, that I get the same assurances from Scooter that he was not involved that I received from Karl. And Scooter told me, no, absolutely not. I wasn't involved in this. And clearly, that wasn't proven to be true. That was not true, and it was a very disillusioning period for me when I learned first from the media that this was about to happen, that the revelations were showing that they did know these 2 individuals were involved in the leaking of Valerie Plame's identity. Yesterday, Ari Fleischer said that you thought you'd been pushed by your editors. Did your editors make the book more sensational or more critical than you originally intended? Ari's comments are not accurate. I don't know where he's getting that from. In the run-up to the Iraq War, as you know, the administration linked Iraq to 9/11, to the point where the majority of the American people believed there was, in fact, a connection, even though none actually existed. Did the White House intentionally promote the notion of this connection in order to bolster support for the war? I don't think so. I think that there is an impression left because of the connections we were making to al-Qaeda in terms of Iraq, that there are contacts there. The Vice President, as he tended to do, got a little more out front than others. He did make that suggestion. Yes, he did. But the President always avoided that, and I believe my predecessor, as well as me, always avoided making that connection as well. Well, why did the Vice President do so? You know, I don't know. He is someone who sometimes does things his own way, and I think that this President probably too often has shown him too much deference. Do you feel any sense of guilt that the Iraq War, which you helped sell to the American people, has resulted in the loss of life for thousands of American soldiers? Well, I do want to make sure that we learn from what happened and that we don't repeat the mistake of rushing into war again unprepared for the aftermath of the invasion. Our troops have done an amazing job, and I've been with the President and walked by his side often when he would visit the wounded or when he would visit with families of fallen, and they're very moving moments. I mean, it's a very sincere President who comforts them. But I'm someone also who comes from a moral viewpoint that we shouldn't be going to war unless it's absolutely necessary. I do believe now, looking back and reflecting and knowing what I know now, which a lot of which we didn't know at the time, that this was a war of choice. The President was sincere in his belief, but the driving motivation was that we're going to go in and make Iraq the linchpin for transforming the Middle East and creating a new democracies throughout the Middle East. But do you feel as if you played a role, Scott, in misleading the American public? I think what I was doing at the time was
sincere. It was speaking on behalf of the president.
But you knew that some of the intelligence
in the build-up to the war. Again, I was the
cherry-picked.
deputy press secretary at the time. I was
Still,
not the White House press
and
secretary.
you filled in.
I filled in it a few times, and I did talk about the build-up to the war and did help spread that message as well. Looking back on that, I would not do that again.
On your last day, the president said this about you. Let's take a listen.
One of these days, he and I are going to be rocking on chairs in Texas, talking about the good old days.
Can you envision that ever happening now?
I don't plan on it at this point. I'm sure the president is not too happy about this book, but this book has a much larger purpose than one person or this presidency, and that purpose is to really, hopefully, help us change things in Washington, and by learning from what we went through and learning from the mistakes that were made.
I know you described the White House bubble, Scott, but if you had real ethical and moral problems with the way things were being handled and the message, the misleading message that was being delivered at the time, why didn't you step forward, or why didn't you resign and say, this is wrong?
We need to make some distinctions here. At the time, in the build-up to the war, I was willing to give the president and his team the benefit of the doubt, just like many Americans, and believed a lot of what was being said. I sincerely believed it as well. As time went on, and it turned out there were no WMD, and then as I was able to step outside of that bubble and reflect on this time period and look back at it with a clear-eyed view, I came to some different conclusions from what I felt at the time.
But couldn't you have spoken up earlier and made a difference?
Well, there were two moments that were defining moments for me personally when I did start thinking about leaving the White House. One was the revelations with Karl Rove and Scooter Libby that they were involved in the leaking of Valerie Plame's identity. The other was in early April, when I learned directly from the president in a private conversation in Air Force One that he had authorized the secret declassification of parts of the national intelligence estimate on Iraq for the vice president to anonymously get out to reporters, something that we had decried throughout our time in the White House, saying that the selective declassification or selective leaking of classified information is wrong, and here the president had done what we had decried for so long. That was a very disillusioning moment for me. But this is a process you go through. You have great hope in the person you go to work for as someone who believes in public service, and someone who you know has a record of being a bipartisan leader, and you think that he can come and do that in Washington. And this whole experience was a political education for me. I've learned a lot from it.
But when the president declassified this national intelligence estimate, which, as you say, was totally contrary to his philosophy.
Only 3 people knew it.
And everything he believed.
Right.
Why not step forward then?
Well, actually, that was in April 6, 2006, shortly before I left. I had made a decision that I was not going to stay any longer than July 15th of that year, which would have been my 3-year mark. We were going through change at the time, and I thought, okay, I'll wait till we get through this. Then Josh Bolten, the new chief of staff, came on, and he had plans for changing my position, and that was fine because I was ready to leave at the same time, just not right at that time.
Is this book in any way payback for you being pushed out of your position by Josh Bolten?
Not at all, because like I said, one, I was ready to leave, and I think I tell the story of that in my book, my departure from the White House. I'm disappointed in the way things turned out, but you've got to be able to step back from this and look at this from a big picture and hopefully give readers a clear-eyed look at what we can learn from it all.
You at one point had great admiration for President Bush. Given your reflections and the contents of this book, how do you feel about President Bush now? How would you assess him as a leader?
I still have a lot of personal affection for him, but I think that some of his policy judgments have been misplaced. And it's hard to make that distinction when you have served someone for as long as you did. But I've also served the American people, and I've had a career in politics and public service. This book is an extension of that, a way to continue to make a positive difference, and a way to look back and recognize where I fell short can be a way to learn and improve things in the future.
You said his policy judgments had been misplaced. Some of his policy judgments were misplaced.
Yes.
That sounds fairly lukewarm in terms of an assessment of an administration which you say embarked on a propaganda campaign that misled the American people into going into a war of choice.
Yeah, we got caught up in the whole culture of Washington and the permanent campaign culture, and we took that, and where it becomes most troubling is when you take that mentality and transfer it to the war-making decision. and then you're not embracing the high level of openness and forthrightness that is so needed and so critical during a time of war.
How do you think this book will impact future administrations and the journalists who cover them?
I hope that everybody can learn from it. If anybody's interested in changing Washington, I think there's a lot to be learned from this book and a lot to be learned from what I experienced.
And do you think future administrations will engage in this kind of behavior and this kind of false or certainly twisted communication to achieve any
the whole
goal?
Political spin, political manipulation that has come to permeate Washington, and it's inherently deceptive. Not that, you know, these are all good people, or for the most part very good people that came here with the right intentions, and most of it is incidental and harmless. But when it transfers into issues of war and peace, then it becomes much more grave and much more serious. And that's why, looking back and reflecting on this, there's a lot that we can learn from this, and that's why we need to change this kind of mentality, and that's why we need to end this destructive permanent campaign culture in Washington, D.C.
Would you say, Scott, that the Bush administration intentionally lied to the American people?
No, I think that that's a highly charged word, and I think that it was not deliberate or intentional on anybody's part or conscious on their part. They just got caught up in playing the game the way it's played in Washington. This is the way everybody plays it. And when that happens and it transfers over into war, then it becomes much more troubling.
Isn't that a cop-out to say it wasn't intentional?
No, I think that there's a tendency in Washington to want to paint things in stark black and white terms. And I think that when that happens, it just becomes a partisan, partisan verbal squabbling, and we lose sight of the larger truths. What I'm trying to do is get at the larger truths here behind all that happened.
So you're saying this is the way the game is played in Washington?
It is.
I know the Bush family has been very supportive of you and your family. You had a brother who also worked in government as well. Do you feel as if you're biting the hand that fed you? Do you feel any sense of disloyalty writing this?
I don't look at it that way, because there's a loyalty that's much higher than my loyalty to my past public service, and that's a loyalty to understand the truth and a loyalty to the way I was raised, the values I was raised upon, which means I was raised in a political family that believed very deeply in public service and the importance of speaking up and making a positive difference. Hopefully I've done that with this book.
Scott McClellan. Scott, thanks very much.
Thanks, Katie.